I do recognise quite a lot of the names, which is always a pleasure, but equally there are quite a few I don't. So if I may, I'll start very briefly by introducing myself, and obviously a very warm welcome to all of you. My name, as you can see, is Monica Bohm-Deutsch, and I'm the founding director of the Insiders Outsiders project, and I've had the great pleasure of working with David Herman for a very long time on that. He's a much valued trustee of the Insiders Outsiders Arts Foundation that sort of underpins the project. But for those of you who don't know about it, it was a small idea that got big and gratifyingly big with a wonderful afterlife. It took the form initially of a year-long nationwide in-person arts festival, paying tribute and also examining in a much more sort of wide-ranging but also nuanced and detailed way the extraordinarily rich contribution that refugees from Nazi-dominated Europe have made then and indeed since, their legacy also to British culture across many, many different disciplines. And then COVID struck. It was from March 2019 to March 2020, and I think we all know what happened then. And the project went online, as so many projects had to do, and it's been a blessing in disguise, as my wonderful father used to say, in that it has given the project an unexpectedly viable, if I could say that, afterlife in the form mostly of an ongoing program of online events such as this. I'm going to hand over to David in a minute, but I will say that Rüdiger and I have not crossed swords at all. Actually, that's the wrong phrase, but we had a very fruitful conversation, as I recall, way back in 2021 when his book on Oskar Kokoschka first came out. But I think we can perhaps put that one to one side for the moment. But it's a great pleasure, Rüdiger, to have you back with us. Right. But a word about David Herman. Many of you, I think, will have come across him in one way or another. He was a very well-established TV and radio producer for over 20 years, and more recently has written about art, literature, and Jewish issues, often, of course, intersecting for a wide range of prestigious publications. I should add, perhaps just for the record, that he is the son of a wonderful artist, Joseph Herman, Polish-born Jewish refugee from Nazi Europe. And as I mentioned, a trustee of the Arts Foundation, and very much my go-to person when it comes to literature. And I'm very delighted, David, and thankful that you alerted me to Rüdiger's latest book, of course, on Stefan Zweig. So forgive me if you can hear my outbooks. Look, making too much noise. I shall shut it up in a minute. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over now to David to basically take over. And hopefully there'll be some good questions and discussion towards the end.
Thank you so much, Monica. Tonight I'll be interviewing Rüdiger Görner about his new biography of Stefan Zweig, In the Future of Yesterday. Professor Görner was Professor of German with Comparative Literature at Queen Mary University in London. His books include biographies of Rilke, Georg Trakl, and, as Monica mentioned, Oskar Kokoschka. This is his second book about Zweig, one of the most famous Jewish literary refugees from Central Europe. And I'll be talking with Professor Görner about his book for about 45 minutes, and then we'll throw the conversation open to you, and we'll aim to finish around 7 o'clock. Professor Görner, there have been a number of biographies of Stefan Zweig recently. There's been a terrific film inspired by Zweig, the Grand Budapest Hotel, and recently there was a play at the Hampstead Theatre in London based on his famous story, Letter from an Unknown Woman. And Pushkin Press in particular here has republished a number of books of his essays. Why do you think there's been such a huge revival of interest in Zweig's life and work?
I dare say it is the sheer relevance of what Zweig had offered in terms of literature, in terms of fiction, essays, and also political comments. Zweig, I think, is of vital interest in many ways because of his genuine European stance, because of the kind of network, as we would say these days, that he managed to create. And also, and this is often forgotten, his immense background work for young writers. This is someone who was helping others. This is a form of altruism which is not so overcommon, let's put it that way, amongst literati, but in his case it certainly was. The other reason, I dare say, why Zweig is of such eminence and significance to the very day is the sheer style of writing. It is an eminently accessible writer. It is a writer who had something to say about not just the psyche of individuals, his fictitious characters and historical characters, but he has a great deal to say about what it means to write about the psyche of someone else. It is not that, even though he wrote about Freud, as you know, but it is not that he puts his fictitious characters on the couch and asks them funny questions. It is very much his concern how problems in an individual, in fact, developed, emerged. And I think his interest in the individual and, of course, the position of the individual in a collective. This is something, this interplay, this is something which I dare say is fascinating. And there's a third reason, in my view, and this has to do with, let's use the word obsession, with Zweig's obsession with the moment. Der Augenblick is something extremely important to him. Sternstunden der Menschheit as the most famous example. He looks towards moments in history, turning points, and describes why they are so important that we actually perceive them. His interest in the past is not academic by any means. He was able to enliven facts and data. And this way of communicating the significance of history and insights into history, I think this is very much what makes him so eminently relevant. I dare say
and the life as well.
Sorry.
And the life as well. So it's a combination of a tremendously prolific output as a writer, but also this fascinating life.
Yes, the fascinating life, whereby it is, of course, quite interesting that he was a bit more guarded than we are these days about what life means, especially his own life. If you consider the world of yesterday, yes, it is to a certain extent autobiographical, but only to a certain extent. He was very, very keen to move towards something that I would call the subjective objectivity. That is to say, aiming towards objectivity without denying that this is a relative concept. There cannot be an absolute objectivity. But it is interesting that in one of those rather distinctly autobiographical chapters in The World of Yesterday, where he talks about his adolescence, his awakening, as it were, as a male, this was inserted because his first wife, Friederike, she suggested to him, be a little bit more personal in your memoirs, as it were. But we should not forget, of course, that The World of Yesterday was written under intense emotional pressure. This is right toward the end of his life. This is writing about the cherished Europe of his past outside Europe. This is written in the US and, of course, to a certain extent, still in Brazil. And when one reads The World of Yesterday, I think this is an element one should not forget. It is not just a book about history. It is about the way in which he clarifies, he demonstrates that the past is always catching up with us, but the past doesn't repeat itself just like that. There's always something different. And this difference, this différence, I think is important to him.
And you call him at one point a reluctant modernist.
Yes.
And I wonder whether part of his appeal is also this mix of being a traditionalist in some respects and a modernist in other respects.
I think you're absolutely right. It is very much this ambiguity towards what modernism entails. On the one hand, he does not want to betray historical values, traditional values. On the other hand, he knows that as an artist, that he was in the highest degree, as a commentator of his time, as someone who is looking forward. He has to open up. And he has to open up towards trends and tendencies in culture that he was very aware of, even though he does not always make use of it. He is, despite what he says about the radio, for example, he was quite clearly keen on this new medium in his time. He is one who stood in front of a camera, a TV camera in the BBC. We have this famous photograph. We haven't got the actual recording. But this is not someone who closed off when it came to new media, far from it. And at the same time, he's interested in modernist trends in art and literature. This is someone who knew James Joyce personally. This is someone who wrote one of the first major reviews, and I make quite a, we could say, a meal of this in this biography. He made quite a meal of this Ulysses, which puzzled him. It is one of the most fascinating reviews that I know of when it comes to James Joyce's Ulysses. Simply because, and this is so characteristic for Zweig's approach to, yes, historical, traditional literary values and what we do with them in the present. He comes from the point of view in this review of a reader, innocent reader, who is confronted with this Ulysses. We are talking about 1929, first translation of Ulysses into German. And he somehow tentatively moves towards appreciating this strange text, which somehow requires commentary all the time, so he thinks. And he moves step by step towards a full, eventually enthusiastic appreciation of this, what he calls revolutionary work in literature. So he knows what's going on here in this sphere of modernism at the end of the 1920s from his point of view. And he meets, for example, in Paris, he meets, again, I think it's 28, 29, he meets Salvatore Dali. So he is in many ways very clear about the significance of new tendencies in culture. And one thing which I didn't include in this biography because I came across this much later, but this is something worth exploring further in my view, if one can. He recommended in a letter to the very young Theodor Adorno, another emigre at the time in Oxford for a brief period. He recommends to Adorno in 1937 that he should write, Adorno, he should write a monograph on Schönberg. Quite remarkable, because what we don't have in this very, very rich oeuvre of Stefan Zweig, we have very few texts on music, which puzzled me, because we are talking about a writer who, as a librettist, wrote one of the most fascinating librettos for Richard Strauss, namely The Silent Woman. He had a very fine ear, quite clearly. But he was reluctant, I think out of sheer respect, he was reluctant to really transform music into, shall we say, fiction, shall we say, essayistic prose and whatever. To my knowledge, there are no reviews, for example, of any concerts that he attended. And he did attend concerts, of course he did. This is someone who, after all, lived in Salzburg. He witnessed the beginning of the Salzburg Festival, etc., etc. And of course, his close collaboration, as I said, with Richard Strauss speaks volumes, both in terms of artistic creativity and the problematic political side that, of course, is somehow represented by this relationship between Strauss and Zweig for reasons we're all aware of.
And as you were saying, he knew an astonishing number of the leading figures of European culture not just German-speaking culture, but altogether French, British, all kinds of people, which is, I think, almost unique. I can hardly think of another major European writer like that who knew so many people from different areas of culture.
Yes, I think this is a phenomenon, and one has to say he worked on it. He really worked on it. This was for him the reality, the cultural reality of his belief in a European identity. And one of the most important features that I found in terms of the significance of what he tried to do is, of course, his relationship with Romain Rolland. This is almost second to none. The correspondence between Rolland and Stefan Zweig, I think, is an absolute treasure. It's a treasure trove. And it had its amazing ups and downs, quite dramatic ones, especially in one particular moment. The German bombardment of Louvain in the First World War in Belgium is something that Rolland felt was an absolute outrage. And he could not understand why his close friend, Stefan Zweig, would first of all deny that this actually had happened. And this is a point where this friendship is at risk. But it survived the First World War, and it somehow was the foundation again for Zweig's extraordinary attempt in the 1920s. And I honestly think the 1920s for him, perhaps right up to 35, was the highlight, so to speak, of his also political engagement on behalf of Europe. And this connection with Rolland somehow symbolized it to him, and I think to us, with the benefit of hindsight when we go through these letters. But let's not forget that Zweig, already prior to the First World War, is the first in Austria to take Belgian writers seriously. This is the first translator of Emil Verhaeren. This is the first author of a study, call it a biography, small biography, short biography, on Emil Verhaeren. He is very knowledgeable about Maurice Maeterlinck, etc., etc., etc. That is to say, again, the old connection between Habsburg and the Low Countries, Flanders, etc., etc. He somehow revitalizes this through his interest in those writers of today, of his time. And I think that these kind of networks that he tried to generate, they made his European stance credible. And from my point of view, I have to say, to the very day, a model for any form of cultural European integration, or an integration on cultural grounds. You know?
And partly what made this network sort of function in a way was because he was such an assiduous traveler. He just traveled around Europe constantly.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. It is a traveler. It's a traveler who also was keen to produce travelogues, which he did. And of course, the sheer wealth, again, of his correspondence is testimony to what he tried to look for in these various countries. There's hardly any country which he left out. There are, shall we say, obvious destinations for him, and less obvious destinations. I give you an example, 1928. He's invited by Maxim Gorky to address the people of Moscow at the occasion of the centenary of Tolstoy's birth. And he travels there and expects to give a short address amongst many others. No, this is not to happen. The Bolshoi is full to capacity, and there is Stefan Zweig, and is supposed to give, off the cuff, a speech about Tolstoy, which he delivered, without much preparation. I hasten to add, at least that's how he describes it himself. And it was a roaring success. Now, that, of course, on the other hand, is also somehow illustrates a problem. It's a problem that is a kind of demarcation of the second low point of this friendship with Romain Rolland. Rolland was famously very much in favor of this new or not so new Russia or Soviet Union. And he, even by the beginning of the 1930s, he was not prepared to see the beginnings of serious Stalinism as a problem. Zweig at first was enthusiastic about this Russia. He was about the Soviet Union. But that changed rather quickly. And he became very, very skeptical about what was happening there. He was friendly with, also quite interesting, he was friendly with Lunacharsky. Lunacharsky was the Minister for Education. And Lenin had appointed him. And Lunacharsky was very much on Zweig's side. He was probably also behind his invitation of 28. But Zweig witnessed almost the fall of Lunacharsky, the way in which Stalin dealt with his minister, and was almost a witness to the dramatic downfall of Lunacharsky when he went to Spain, had to go to Spain, was supposed to be ambassador of the Soviet Union in Spain, and basically on the way was murdered by Stalin's henchmen. And these kind of political murders is something that Zweig was very, very aware of in the 1920s. The most shocking experience for him on a personal front was the assassination of Walter Rathenau in 1922.
Who was a friend of his?
Who was a friend of his. Who was a friend of his. And let's not forget, it was Rathenau before the First World War, who at that time had no political function, but obviously was an eminent industrialist. But it was Rathenau who recommended to Zweig to travel to India. We're talking about 1907. And this, shall we say, interest in creating networks, of course, went far beyond Europe in the first place. We have him interested in India. We have him interested in a very early stage in the United States. Of course, also in Britain, whereby he is, interestingly enough, never so quite sure whether Britain is now actually Europe or not, or is there something else, or, you know, where am I, as it were, when I go to London. This is prior to the First World War. But the essence, the sheer essence and the cultural essence of this networking remains European, right to the bitter end.
And then comes a fascinating move when he moves from his beloved Vienna to Salzburg.
Yes.
And what prompted that move?
I think it had a lot to do with one simple coincidence. It was in the last year of the First World War that he and Friederike came from Switzerland, because let's not forget, Zweig in the last years of the First World War lived in Switzerland as a correspondent for the Neue Freie Presse, and his anti-war play, Jeremiah, was first performed in Zurich. Interestingly enough, during the First World War, it was possible to perform Jeremiah 1917 in Zurich, which was an open appeal as far as he was concerned for peace, for ending conflict, etc., etc. Anyway, both came to Salzburg. He knew, of course, Salzburg fairly well beforehand. But by coincidence, they saw this empty, smallish palais on the Kapuzinerberg in Salzburg. And it was Friederike who prompted him to buy it, which he did, cash buyer that he was. And this house became, or rather this palais, a very historical building, now incidentally transformed into a private house, but probably one hopes, the Salzburgers hope, with an annex of a kind of Zweig museum. The Porsches have bought this, so here we go. And this house turns into a venue for the most extraordinary, shall we say, number of visitors in the 1920s. It is, on the one hand, his haven. On the other hand, he finds it sometimes too close for comfort to the Salzburg Festival buzz. He wanted to distance himself quite clearly from the Viennese literati. He kept them at arm's length to a certain extent. Initially, not, but eventually, yes. But he was intrigued, he was interested in this idea of the Salzburg Festival as obviously entertained by Max Reinhardt and Hugo von Hofmannsthal. So he was close by, but not directly involved, as it were. But nonetheless, this extraordinary home of his was a place where he could somehow translate this network of correspondence into a place where they could actually meet. And this did happen. This did happen. We have from Thomas Mann to obviously Reinhardt and others, plenty of literati and artists who came and visited him there. Tragically, it was also that very place, which was in 1934 searched because the Austro-fascists believed that he was hoarding weapons in this place to supply the communists with weapons against them. And this was as grotesque and as absurd as it possibly can be, because we are talking about one of the most eminent pacifist voices, especially in the 1920s, early 30s. He was horrified by this. He wasn't present when this happened, but Friederike was, his wife was. And it was basically the reason why he decided then also to leave Salzburg, to move towards Switzerland, France again, and then eventually, of course, permanently, for the time being, as it were, to England. And
two striking things about the choice of Salzburg, it seems to me. One is that it's a very Catholic center as opposed to Vienna, which had a very large Jewish intelligentsia and so on. And secondly, that it's very, very close to the border.
Yes. He makes a lot of that in The World of Yesterday. He claims that from the balcony he could unfortunately see directly to the Berghof in Berchtesgaden. Not true, by the way, you can't see it from there, but that's a different matter. He was close to the German border indeed, which was to his benefit initially. I mean, after all, his main publisher was in Germany, Kippenberg in Leipzig. And he needed the German basis, as it were, for his work, of course. Like Thomas Mann, he would always say he has his best readers there, for better or worse. And you are absolutely right. It is surprising that he had chosen one of the truly most Catholic corners. But I don't think that mattered to him that much, because he was, the sheer location of Kapuzinerberg, it was an elevation. He was elevated. He was literally above all of this. And he saw very much this cultural side. And let's face it, also the Jewish main figure behind the Salzburg Festival, Max Reinhardt, and also Hugo von Hofmannsthal were Jewish. But they felt that for the Salzburg Festival, this was the place. After all, it was Mozart's place, and it mattered. It mattered. And it is also true that probably Zweig also felt confirmed in his choice because anyone who was anybody in the musical world, of course, in the literary world, came to Salzburg in those days. And you have, of course, Toscanini appearing there, even at the time when the Nazis in Germany tried to make it difficult for tourists to come to Salzburg soon after Hitler came to power. And in a similar vein, we have, of course, this fascination of Salzburg that radiated right to, well, Oskar Kokoschka. We have the similar phenomenon, yeah, admittedly more after the Second World War, but there you are. But I think in cultural terms, Salzburg was, to Zweig, Europe in a nutshell. Also with the Catholic heritage, yes, of course, yes. But I don't think it really mattered to him that crucially.
And you mentioned just in passing that he was a cash buyer. And of course, he was a cash buyer because he was enormously successful as a writer. And his books, he was a bestseller. He wrote endless bestsellers. Yeah. Why do you think that was? What was his appeal to German-speaking readers in particular? Biographies, essays, fiction?
It is, I think, his choice of authors that he worked on, of historical figures that he worked on. He had a sixth sense, what would work and what wouldn't work, quite clearly. Even when he decided to write this remarkable biography on Marie Antoinette, which was not directly seen as something that would immediately cotton on with German-speaking readership, but he was sure it would, and it did. And even when he had Mary Stuart published in 1935, the first book that was then done with his new publisher in Vienna, after the discord, a serious discord with Kippenberg and Insel Verlag, his resonance was still very, very strong with such topics like the difficulties of power that are epitomized by Mary Stuart and Marie Antoinette likewise for different reasons. But in the 20s, I honestly think the capturing of the demonic, after all, this is one of his pastimes, to write about the demonic in writers, be it Nietzsche, be it Kleist, be it Dostoevsky, that fascinated people. And people wanted to clearly see biographies, one after the next. It was the age of the biography, as we have it again. When you talk to any literary agent these days, they still tell you, write biographies. That's what is, what people want to see. And that was already the case, clearly, in the 1920s. We have some eminent writers alongside Stefan Zweig who focused on biography writing. For example, Wassermann, Emil Ludwig. These were eminent figures, eminent writers, who also focused precisely on that. But their style was just perhaps a touch more, dare I say it, clumsy. It didn't have this remarkable panache that you have in Zweig's writings. And the one thing he managed to do that his rivals, so to speak, perhaps failed to do, he worked out particular themes that would matter. For example, mental healers. This is the English title, or rather the American title, of an essay collection that deals, for example, with Mesmer, Franz Anton Mesmer, and Freud, etc. That was of interest. As I said, the struggle with the demonic was another such topic. A simple general title like Three Masters, the master writer, that's what he subsumed, for example, Tolstoy and others to. And it was, of course, a period, one has to be clear about this, that was looking for spiritual leadership. Eventually, too much of political leadership as well. But it was cultural leadership, spiritual leadership that drove those writers to focus on these individuals. Think of a great biographer of a very, very different kind, totally different kind, Friedrich Gundolf. Gundolf with his Goethe, with his study on Shakespeare, with his study on Luther. As a Jewish intellectual, one has to say. All this, I think, somehow came together in Zweig's success and resulted in this success. And of course, he was the object of incredible envy. People referred to him as, in the German it reads, the Erwerbszweig. That is to say, the Zweig, the branch of the tree, Zweig, twig, the branch of the tree that always is a golden one, because he can manage to turn everything into gold, as it were, whatever he touches. It's the Midas problem. But not so. Yes, he was extremely successful, but one has to say that Zweig, as I mentioned earlier on, he supported an extraordinary amount of people. He just was, in so many ways, yes, very aware of his success for sure, but we cannot reduce him to the mere financial successes. We can't reduce him to that, not at all. It was ultimately a means to an end.
You mentioned two particular biographies, Marie Antoinette and Mary Stuart, and I wonder if another reason for his success is his insight into female psychology, both in his biographies and in his fiction.
This is, you're absolutely right. This is a phenomenon which we don't have in so many writers at the time. His sensitivity, his understanding of the female psyche, also a female psyche like with Marie Antoinette, who aspired to greatness, power in any case, was almost second to none. And one has to see, and you are right in suggesting this, one has to see his fiction about female characters, The Post Office Girl and what have you. One has to see this in tandem with his interest in, for want of a better word, the female politician. Yeah. And with Marie Antoinette, however, she was portrayed by him, quite rightly so, as a political character by default, someone who never wanted to be in this role. It was actually her tragedy that she was. That's how she's portrayed in Zweig. Incidentally, some of you will remember the film about Marie Antoinette with Kidman. And I think it was Antonia Fraser who was quoted as the person who supported, as it were, the historical material for this film. This may be so, but I dare say Antonia Fraser got a great deal from the Marie Antoinette biography by Stefan Zweig. I know this is probably a controversial statement to make, but I make it nonetheless.
We come, of course, to this final stage of his life where he becomes a refugee and he comes to London. Why did he choose London first? And this was long before the fall of France, of course.
It is indeed. Bear in mind that it was only weeks before the German invasion of France that he gave a lecture there in Paris on Vienna as it was. Now, to try to answer your question, he was relatively familiar with England, but it was in England before the First World War that he knew and wrote about. He had, however, connections with England through people that he knew, through interests that he had. He was very interested in, for example, George Bernard Shaw. He was interested in the literary scene there, although he tries to later to somehow minimize this and doesn't put too much emphasis on this. But one main reason was work, as always with him. It was the British Library. The British Library was a major attraction, and in particular in connection with his work on Mary Stuart. And that bound him to initially to London, but the decision to stay there was simply because he felt he could breathe there, at least for a while. And by 35, I think the decision was quite clearly had formed in him to stay there as long as possible. As you know, he then found his place, his dwelling place in Hallam Street, etc. It looked as if he could really find a proper home there for himself with his new, eventually then second wife, with Lotte Altmann. During this period, and especially after 38, he was suddenly confronted, obviously, with refugees who were looking also for him, towards him, for support. And he somehow tries to do his utmost to support them, to help them. You find him, literally and non-literally speaking, as often in Tavistock House as you would find him in Hallam Street. He helped wherever he could. And that quite often, it also was too much for him. And he felt, we have several references in letters where he says he can't anymore. He cannot continue to respond creatively enough to all these demands that are suddenly on him by refugees. Nonetheless, he keeps going, as it were, to the point where he then decides to move away from London. The move away from London, 39, is similar to the move away from Vienna. He moves to Salzburg then, he moves from London to Bath. And interestingly, he likens Bath to Salzburg and says, you know, also lovely hills and everything, not quite the mountains, but it's very, shall we say, comfortable to live there. One is away from the center, even though ever so often he had to go back to London for all sorts of reasons. But this shall we say, point of comparison is Salzburg and remains Salzburg. He does the same thing afterwards in Petropolis, where he says Petropolis looks like Bath, looks like Salzburg. Yeah.
Petropolis in Brazil, which is his final destination.
His final destination. His final destination.
And the most puzzling of all, it seems to me.
Yes, puzzling of all, puzzling also because it is the Brazil of Vargas, after all, a dictator. However, he was feted in Brazil as the author of this book on Brazil, as the country of the future, as he puts it. And we have to read somehow the world of yesterday in conjunction with this new perspective that he thinks he has identified in Brazil, the country of the future, where in his view, not quite in reality, but in his view, all ethnic communities somehow could cohabitate and could experience tolerance of sorts. he simply wanted to eclipse that it became also quite difficult for Jewish emigres in Brazil to stay there. He was in a privileged position because Vargas somehow saw in him an iconic figure. To the very day, scholars discuss whether Zweig had written this book on Brazil, 36, has written this basically commissioned by the Vargas government. I personally cannot find any evidence for this that really would hold. He was genuinely convinced that the future of civilization would no longer be in Europe, but would be elsewhere. And in this case, he thought it might be South America. But when he realized that South America was also under threat, when he realized that the Japanese fleet became too close for comfort to the Brazilian coast, this is one of the elements that may have triggered his decision to take his own life, together, of course, with his wife, with Lotte.
And this is the final mystery. Here is an incredibly successful literary figure. Yes. He is happily married in his second marriage.
Yes.
Why the suicide, the double suicide?
We can never find an answer to this, I think, and probably, frankly, we shouldn't. I think we can only speculate, but speculation in this case is not idle, but highly problematic. There are assumptions. The assumption is Lotte she suffered from asthma. The mystery is, why did they choose a place to live high up in the mountains where they had to climb God knows how many stairs in order to get to the house? Question one. Question two, he somehow felt desperately cut off from what he still felt was decisive for him for his own work. He writes to the very end. He writes on Balzac. He is desperate to get the Balzac material extracted from Bath. His then very young secretary, Richard Friedenthal, himself an emigre, who is then the one who wrote the first, basically, biography on Zweig, edited his Nachlass, etc., his papers. He sends material from Bath to Petropolis, but somehow he feels out of place. He writes the chess novel, the novella Chess, one of his masterpieces, in basically the last couple of weeks of his life. A colossal achievement, this text. And he will play chess, actually, with his famous chess partner, Karl Fuchs, actually also in Petropolis, where Fuchs also found himself, on Rio de Janeiro. But it seems that he had come to the end of his road. At least he thought he had. And he literally could not imagine a world free from fascism, or even worse, National Socialism. And this idea somehow must have pestered him to an extent that he felt it was unredeemable. And we are talking about the year 1942. And yes, I mean, I think one can be forgiven for thinking that in 1942, it was by no means clear what the outcome of the Second World War would be. Some people took umbrage and were almost offended by this suicide. Famous example, Thomas Mann. He almost reproached him. He wrote a letter of condolence to Friederike, and it's not a very pleasant letter, one has to say. He felt that Zweig, as the other great spokesman of the literary exile in the world, had abandoned them, had abandoned those who were still trying to fight. And again, you can call this understandable, you can call this unjust. It's a matter of discussion, it's a matter of debate.
Professor Görner, thank you so much for a fascinating conversation. It's a wonderful biography. I enjoyed it immensely. Monica, I'm afraid to say that I cannot access the questions online at the moment, and I wonder if you could kindly handle them for me.
I will. You know, the reason is, much to my surprise, in a way, there aren't any yet. So now is the
Oh,
moment.
I see. Right. Well, then in
It's
that
very
case,
simple. They should come up. I think we've been bombarded and possibly dazzled by so many interesting, world-class sort of cultural figures and so many interesting connections that
that
maybe
solves that
we're
mystery. In
feeling
which case, I would
slightly
be
calm.
delighted to leap back into action, Professor, and
Excellent.
ask you about Zweig's legacy.
Yeah.
What do you think
Yeah.
most stands out in his legacy?
What stands out in his legacy, I almost repeat myself here, what I said at the beginning, is the way in which he tells his readers what to do with history, how to engage with history, not just in a nostalgic fashion. That, I think, is very important. You could be forgiven for saying that quite a bit of what he had to say about Vienna in the past, etc., and also the world of yesterday, is somewhat nostalgic. But in essence, it is not. I think he is someone who believes that you can take certain lessons from history. And I think the one thing that he felt very, very strongly about is the ideal of humanism. We are all talking about the KI world of anti-humanism and what have you. I honestly think he wouldn't have it. Someone who wrote a short but masterly biography on Erasmus of Rotterdam, also published in 1935, completed in 1934, really genuinely believed in the problems, the difficulties that humanists have when they want to make their calls, bring across their thoughts, perhaps together with pacifism or not. But this humanist ethos is probably the strongest element of this legacy, at least from my point of view. And the countless readers that find him fascinating to the very day, I think they somehow sense this. Also, and another element, I dare say, is his take on politics, what politics represents. It is not only that he wrote about Marie Antoinette or Mary Stuart, he also wrote about Fouché. Fouché, the kind of pre and post Napoleonic mastermind, Napoleon's minister of the police, a major figure in French history, behind the scenes, as it were. And this is a fascinating thing about Zweig, that he is interested in this grey eminence, as it were, behind the political driving forces that drove the final phase of the French Revolution, that drove Napoleon, that drove what happened after Napoleon in France, the return of the Ancien Regime. He's interested in this chameleon-like figure. And he somehow suggests that politicians, they are, and we have to be aware of this, they are chameleon-like figures. Beware of their abandoning their principles. That is certainly what he's interested in with Fouché. And I find this extraordinary combination fascinating that he offers.
May I put to you a question from John Hillary, who thanks you for your fascinating talk. And he says, Zweig spoke so warmly and nostalgically of Jewish Vienna and the world of yesterday. How have scholars and other commentators dealt with his own relation to Jewishness in the decades since his death?
Yes, it is a very problematic and extremely controversial topic. We have a relatively, in inverted commas, orthodox view that suggests that basically Zweig was always supporting the cause of Jewish culture and Jewish emancipation. The others would suggest that he saw the pitfalls of emancipation, that he saw that emancipation had been betrayed bitterly by especially, but not only, German-speaking societies in the plural. We have his advocacy for a certain while in the mid-1930s for Palestine. But this somehow peters out. He is, for a certain while, also as a young man, he is interested, put it just mildly, he's interested in Zionism because his major connection as a young man in the Wiener Freie Presse, for which he wrote, is of course the literary editor, which is Theodor Herzl. That is to say, Zweig, right from the beginning, was aware of the Zionist cause, but he remains reluctant to fully subscribe to it. We will have endless comments by Zweig in the 1920s and certainly mid-30s still, where he says the real strength of the Jewish people is that they do not form a nation. That is the real strength. That is their legacy. This is what we have to aspire to. It's the transnational idea that Judaism to him represents. It doesn't completely concur with his take on Jeremiah, for example, or the Jeremiah figure. Because Jeremiah, interestingly enough, in his play of 1917, yes, he warns, yes, he is the one who somehow tries to mobilize a departure of the Jewish people after the destruction of the Second Temple, but he somehow disappears as an individual. It's quite extraordinary. He disappears in the group, in the refugees of that generation. And you can't then say whether this is now a statement that suggests transnationalism or whether it suggests that he accepts somehow that the individual submerges, or rather disappears, in this greater idea of a permanent diaspora. It is very difficult to gauge that. His attempt, his very serious attempt, also to found a magazine in the mid-1930s to support the Jewish cause, somehow it doesn't really work. And it seems to me it doesn't work because he is not 100% behind it. He is not 100% behind it. There is always this belief in him that there is a real mission of Jewish culture, and that is transnational. Then, of course, we have this other element, which I think does play a certain part. His close friend, Romain Rolland, I think his interest in the Jewish culture is limited. So this is something which he couldn't really negotiate with him somehow. And it mattered to him what he could discuss with Rolland and what he couldn't discuss with him. In other words, we have his real answer to what he believes as far as Judaism is concerned, Jewish culture is concerned, and its significance, its legacy, is a literary one, not a Jeremiah. But it is a story, the buried candelabra. And the buried candelabra is a fascinating text, absolutely fascinating text. It is obviously, as the name suggests, it's about a menorah, and it is a menorah that is hidden in the desert. And no one can find it. No one can find it. And this is where it continues to be of significance. Yeah? It's the, literally speaking, the underlying, also grandeur, phenomenon of Jewish culture that continues to prevail. And whether we unearth this menorah or not, from the point of view of his story, is frankly neither here nor there. You may call this, you may criticize this as rather too cavalier, or you might say, well, there is perhaps something rather remarkable in this attitude, which he somehow never ever gave up fully.
And there was something rather remarkable about listening to you this evening. Thank you so much. I forgot to mention that your biography of Stefan Zweig is published by House Publishing and in hardback, and I recommend it most highly. Thank you so much for your time this evening, and thank you to everyone in the audience for joining us. Thank you.
Thank you, David, for orchestrating the discussion so beautifully. Can I just also add a sort of crassly commercial point, and that is that the publishers have kindly offered a 25% discount on the book. You go to the House Publishing website, and Zweig25 are the magic the magic code you need. The event, some of you will have already realized, has been recorded, so do tell people about it. There were various people signed up who didn't in fact come tonight. I'm certainly sure they will do the same. But and also, if you're not familiar with the Insiders Outsiders YouTube channel, you will find the Kokoschka discussion, the more solo presentation that Rüdiger gave a few years ago, but also many other things besides, covering many different art forms and all sorts of interesting cultural terrain. And if you're interested in finding out more about what Insiders Outsiders gets up to in the future, do go to the insidersoutsiders.festival.org website. And if you scroll down to the bottom right of almost any page, but start with the home page, you can subscribe to our newsletter, and then you'll be kept informed. I think that's probably enough. There's much to think about. My goodness, I mean, a really densely packed, wonderful discussion. There were many things I wanted to kind of chip in with, but I think the night is drawing on much to ponder. So thank you, everybody, for being with us, and I look forward to seeing you again at future events. All the very best and good night. Rüdiger, thank you so much. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
All the best. Bye. Bye.